Hi, folks. Welcome back. Moving right along, we're getting ready to head into part three, Hispanic Americans. We'll be looking at colonization, immigration, and the development of ethnic enclaves. It's a particularly important topic today. Um, one of the groups that uh, President Trump has singled out is Hispanics in reference to immigration, deportation. Um, he has made it a point to uh, make immigration a conflict-oriented issue in the United States. So let's take a look at what's going on with immigration in reference to those of Hispanic origin. And yeah, let's get going. So, before Jamestown was founded, the ancestors of some Hispanic groups were already in North America. Um, that meaning the populations that were dominated by the Spanish. Hispanic Americans represent more than 16.6% of the total population. It's estimated by the year 2050 that one out of every three Americans will be Hispanic. This is one of the things that has the advantaged white population in the United States feeling a little bit threatened. Hispanics are partly an ethnic group and partly a racial group. And as is the case with all minority groups, labels and groups are important. A recent survey shows that only 25% of Hispanic Americans use Hispanic or Latino to describe themselves. Most identify themselves by their family's country of origin, and 21% of them think of themselves as America. And this is extremely important because we seem to discuss the category of Hispanic as being some sort of unified group, and that is just not the case. There is a lot of conflict that goes on between these groups that consider themselves, that are being lumped together as Hispanic. As you can see, when we break down Hispanic, what we find is that there's Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Dominicans, El Salvadorians, Guatemalans, Colombians, Hondurans, Ecuadorians, and Nicaraguans. And when you look at this graph, this pie chart, you see that the vast majority, almost three-fourths of the population that is considered Hispanic in the United States is of Mexican origin. Next category that's not, it's not like it's close, but the next largest category is Puerto Ricans, and then the rest of the categories are pretty limited in reference to overall numbers of Hispanic population. This is extremely important, especially as we try to interpret politically what this population, i.e., the Hispanic population, is going to do over time. In reference to Mexican Americans, Mexicans were conquered and colonized in the 19th century. They were used for cheap labor. In many of the areas the dominant group was operating, especially in the Southwest. Of course, by the dawn of the 20th century, Mexican Americans resembled Native Americans in some ways, Southern African Americans in other ways. So their treatment, in many respects, falls in line with what happened to Native Americans. And Mexicans or Mexican Americans that come from Mexico or were in the Southwest, it is not a far cry to understand them as being of Native American origin. I would imagine if you were to take those of Native American origin in the United States and you would compare them um, genetically to those that are coming from Mexico and South and Central America. Uh, these people are drawn from the same stock, if you will. So really what we're doing is we're looking at the differences in culture, and the cultural differences create cleavages of conflict for sure. The most crucial difference was the proximity of the southern or of the sovereign nation of Mexico, which facilitated constant population movement across the border, continually rejuvenating Mexican culture in the Spanish language, even as they were attacked and disparaged by the Anglo-American society. This is why Mexican culture has such a staying power in the United States. It's because you're continually seeing new immigrants coming into the United States that are carrying with them Mexican culture and then practicing it as they grow into their American experience. Of course, when we start digging into their culture, the vast majority of Mexicans are Catholic. Um, Another characteristic of Mexicans is machismo, and that machismo is a matter of degree and not difference. It's a characteristic that permeates the Hispanic culture, that male-dominated, tough guys, macho act. Mexican Americans place more value on family relations and obligations, so family is important. And we see larger families. Of course, we see this with Catholics in general compared to Protestants, but Mexican families, Mexican American families fall in line as well. So these cultural differences, they serve as the basis for excluding Mexican Americans from larger society. But saying that, they've also provided a basis for group cohesion and unity that has sustained common action and protest activity. So, as with many dominated cultures, they are excluded because of the cultural aspects of who they are. But then at the same time, that's how they are able to come together in solidarity and fight for rights that they feel should be guaranteed to them. Of course, since the early 1900s, the Mexican American experience has largely been shaped by this fluctuating immigration. So we'd like to see, or we'd like to say that the things that Donald Trump is doing at this moment in reference to trying to limit Mexican immigration into the United States, we'd like to say this is an anomaly. Well, that's just not the truth. The varying degree and demand for labor in the low-paying, unskilled sector of the U.S. economy is one of the reasons we either allow for or prevent from people coming into the country. And then, of course, we use the federal immigration policies to close the doors or open them. This has created uneven foreign economic development, and it was one of the bases for the 1910 Mexican Revolution. Another reason for these fluctuations was World War I and European and Asian immigration restrictions. So you can imagine as we restrict European and Asian immigrants from entering the country, we turn to Mexico. Of course, the Depression was a big issue for preventing Mexican labor from coming to the United States. We didn't have enough jobs for those that were here. World War II is another reason for allowing Mexican labor into the United States to pick up the slack for um, service people that were mostly servicemen that were away serving in the war. This is represented by the Bracero program. And then, of course, we see the shutdown with Operation Wetback as those serving start to return back to the workforce. Things start to really change and they get solidified. New rules and regulations get solidified in the U.S. Constitution, especially in reference to the 1965 Immigration Act and Family Preferences. This, of course, is a byproduct of the social movements of the time. A lot of legislation was passed to protect these dominated groups. And then again, we see the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1984 as a pushback to what happened with or how the 1965 Immigration Act and Family Preferences legislation was written. Since then, Congress has really been refusing to overhaul how we deal with immigration in the United States, and this refusal to deal with immigration seriously has allowed for presidents to step in and pass presidential decrees to either allow for, protect, or expel populations that are trying to come to the United States. A couple of examples: Barack Obama passed the DACA legislation, or through executive order, passed the DACA legislation to protect Dreamers in the United States that were not citizens, but they were brought here by their parents, and they were a very vulnerable population. So Barack Obama, through executive order, protects that population, and then Donald Trump comes in and, through executive order, rescinds that protection and starts talking about kicking people out of the country. You can see the trend of Mexican immigration in the United States. We see a relatively small number of immigrants coming in. We do see those numbers start to go up in 1989, 1995, into the 2000s. That's most likely due to the passage of NAFTA and the creation of the North American Free Trade Zone, which allowed for folks to come into the United States in an easier fashion, and it just created a more of a free flow of immigrants from Mexico in particular. So the flow of population from Mexico was, as I was alluding to, stimulated and sustained by powerful domestic and global changes. Mexican immigrants entered into a social system in which a colonized status for the group had already been established. So if you're coming to the United States, you're dealing with a colonized group. And therefore, the twisting history of U.S. policy on Mexican immigration should serve as a reminder that levels of prejudice, racism, and discrimination increase as competition and the sense of the threat between the groups increases. So as this perception that the category that is Hispanic continues to grow, what you can expect to see is certainly more prejudice and more discrimination coming from the dominant group, because Hispanics are now a threat where they were not beforehand.